Are you ready for the next generation of gaming consoles? The Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 are on their way, and they promise to be quicker and shinier and more like PCs than ever before. They're also both powered by AMD, and they may give us a clue as to what we can expect to see in the near future for that company's PC hardware. So, what is new with the PS5 and the Series X? What makes them unique? What makes them different? Let's check it out. Welcome to Upscaled, our explainer show where we break down the tech that makes your gadgets faster. This is another Upscaled in exile, as it were, here. We may be interrupted a few times. It's gonna be okay. But we're doing the best we can, and we've got some news to bring you. This console generation has been a bit of an odd one. It used to be we would see a major update in gaming consoles every 5 years or so, but this generation, the Xbox One and PlayStation 4, actually stretches all the way back to 2013, and those consoles kind of set the template for what we're gonna see in the future here. The chips powering earlier consoles were frequently custom-made parts, and a lot of times based on IBM's PowerPC architecture, which we don't see in a lot of consumer goods anymore. The Xbox One and PS4 were kind of unique in that they were actually both based around AMD's x86 chips, just like a desktop computer or laptop. Sure, there were modifications specific to the consoles, but the individual parts were not that different from what you could just go get off the shelf. This probably helped enable the mid-cycle refresh, when instead of just releasing a whole new console, Microsoft and Sony released the Xbox One X and PlayStation 4 Pro, faster versions of the consoles we already had, which they were able to do without redesigning the chips in them from the ground up. And this also helped them keep compatibility with their libraries of software. In a way, these new consoles are just an extension of that. You can think of them kind of as the double Pro X version of the consoles we've had for almost a decade, keeping the same very PC-like design. But there are a few key differences, and they mostly have to do with the processor, the storage, and everyone's favorite graphics buzzword, ray tracing. Let's start with the CPU. Both of the last-gen consoles used an AMD Jaguar chip, a low-power 8-core processor. Now, despite the 8 cores, and remember, most laptops at the time in 2013 only had 2, this was a pretty lousy processor. On a per-core basis, the closest off-the-shelf part, the Athlon 5150, was only about half as fast as AMD's desktop flagship from 4 years earlier in 2009. So it was not speedy even when it was released, and by today's standard, compared to a flagship like a Ryzen 9 chip, it's about a sixth as fast. Now, clearly this didn't entirely matter. It's not like these systems didn't still play games that looked great, but they were launched with a chip that was at the time already pretty slow. Not anymore. The Series X and PlayStation 5 are both launching with processors based on AMD's current modern Zen 2 design, at 3.8 GHz and 3.5 GHz respectively. The specs sound like they're in line with AMD's Ryzen 7 3700X, one of their top-line current desktop processors. Though with one core held back to help run the OS, they might be a bit more like the R5 3600 and 3600X, AMD's 6-core processors. So, the PS4 and Xbox One were both based on processors that were slow before they even launched, but this new generation will be coming with top-line modern chips. So what does this all mean? Well, in games, CPU power can be a little hard to quantify sometimes, but it frequently helps a lot with physics and advanced AI. Games like Dishonored or even Grand Theft Auto that were trying to simulate a whole open world were always pretty CPU hungry, as are simulation and strategy games like Civilization or Total War. We would argue that the ambitions of some games like Watch Dogs or even some of the Assassin's Creed titles may have had to be dialed back a bit from what we saw in early previews to cope with fairly low-powered processors in the current generation of hardware. So with quicker processors in the new systems, let's hope we get some open worlds that aren't quite so empty. One new thing is how these consoles are handling boost speeds.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't.
Now, traditionally most processors can run faster if they have the power and cooling to allow it, but this can make them a little unpredictable. The Series X is going to run at a constant locked frequency of 3.8 GHz, though it can shift down to 3.6 to enable multi-threading, where each processor can take on multiple tasks. The PS5 will run at 3.5 GHz with multi-threading on by default, but it'll aim for a constant power usage instead of a constant speed, and it can shift that around a bit as needed, say, running the processor a little slower and diverting some more power to the GPU as needed. The idea for both is to just keep things constant. Every game should run the same on every console, regardless of how warm your room is. By targeting a specific power level, too, Sony helps to keep things quieter. They know how much heat the console will probably have to dissipate, so they can target their cooling to work at that level. And I would expect Microsoft is probably doing something similar. The one concern is by not letting the system scale their frequency up or down, you may end up wasting a lot of power. The Series X looks like it could draw more than 400 watts, double the Xbox One. And we reached out to Microsoft to see if there's a low power mode for maybe older games or certain apps, but we haven't heard back yet. You wouldn't want to burn 400 watts an hour watching The Office for the 8th time.
Because of the electricity!
Similarly, by targeting a constant power level, is Sony really going to be running everything at full speed to play some 2D pixel art indie? We're not sure, but for now the answer seems like yes, which is kind of a waste. So onto storage, and here's where things get really interesting. The current generation of consoles is still using mechanical hard drives, while almost certainly your laptop and probably your desktops have moved on to much faster flash-based SSDs. Now, those slow hard drives are part of what lead to very slow load times in games on the consoles. You can actually swap an SSD into the PlayStation or Xbox One, and it will speed things up a bit, but not as much as you might hope. In some cases, it may be a third faster, but that might still leave you with load times of over a minute. The problem is, even with a very fast SSD, the connection in those systems between the storage and the processor just isn't quick enough to move a lot of data. That's all changing with the new generation though. The storage in the Series X and PS5 is seriously fast. Both consoles are using an SSD with a PCI Express 4.0 connector. Now, we are just starting to see drives like this show up on PCs. Most of the super fast SSDs out there are still using 3.0, which maxes out at about 3.5 gigabytes per second, which, it should be said, is still 10 to 20 times faster than the current generation of consoles. The Xbox Series X storage, despite being PCI 4, will actually be a little bit slower than this at 2.4 gigabytes per second base, up to 4.8 or even 6 gigabytes when you factor in compression. The PlayStation 5 just blows past this at 5.5 gigabytes per second, all the way up to 8 or 9 gigabytes a second when you factor in compression. Just a quick reminder how these systems work. To get an image onto your display, your computer or console loads a bunch of texture files from the hard drive and sends it to the video RAM, where the graphics chip will process it into the scene that gets sent to your display. And there can be a lot of texture files. Just think of all the different materials or surfaces you might see in a scene, and they can be big files, especially as developers are targeting higher fidelity graphics and 4K resolution. Textures are one of the biggest bottlenecks in loading a video game, but in the next generation with this super fast storage, that should be greatly improved. The compression helps too. Both systems are using specialized chips to help decompress data coming from the SSD. And they each have their own special compression format that should try to cram more data onto those drives. Moving them as compressed files helps too. You can transfer a lot more data when it's compressed just because it's smaller, there's less to transport. It's kind of like emailing someone a zip file. And with limited space on hard drives and games still arriving on disks, the more they can be compressed, the more graphics, textures, and data you can fit on those disks as well. The companies have been focusing on different uses for this super fast storage. Microsoft has really stressed how to let you pause and resume multiple games. No more returning to the menu, launching a new title, and waiting 2 minutes for it to load. Instead, the game's entire state could be saved into the memory and then retrieved, letting you swap between titles in only a few seconds. Sony instead has been focusing on how short load times in games will be, with a demo surfacing a while ago of the Spider-Man game on the PlayStation 4 taking about 8 seconds to load a level that loaded in less than a second on some prototype PS5 hardware. With speeds this high, you also don't need to worry about loading an entire level's worth of data all at once. Instead, you can just grab what you need to get started and then stream more later as needed. This could also lead to higher fidelity graphics. Instead of having to cram an entire level's worth of texture data into 8 gigabytes like on the PS4, a small part of an individual scene could use the full 16 gigabytes on the PS5. It also makes that 16 gigabytes, which is the same on both of the consoles, make a lot more sense. Sure, it's double what came before, but if you go back even one more generation, the Xbox One, say, has 16 times the memory of the Xbox 360. Still, 16 gigabytes should be plenty when you can load new data into it at multiple gigabytes per second. These speeds could actually change how games are made. Developers have gotten really good at hiding loading screens, but they're frequently still there. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, for example, Lara Croft slows to a walk every time she has to slip through a crack in the wall to get to a new area of a tomb. Or in Gears of War, your character pauses to suddenly talk to someone on the radio. Or the infamous elevators in Mass Effect. Those are all loading screens. They're just cleverly hidden loading screens.
So, anyone want to talk about their people's history? Nope.
Or even games that still just use the classic static graphic with some tips and lore. Essentially, the question is, what would games be like if you didn't need to pause and slow down the action to load a new part of the level? And there's also the question of what will this do to older games? It makes me think of some titles from the past where the speed of the game was actually tied to the speed of the processor, and if you tried to play it on modern hardware, everything just moved way too fast. Will games still work with these super fast loading screens? Will they still be artificially slowed down by these checks that developers put in place? Or will you miss important tips or bits of story on a screen because it moves by too quickly? Lastly, let's talk ray tracing. Now, we've covered this in the past, but this is essentially a technique for super realistic lighting in games that takes a lot of computing power. NVIDIA premiered ray tracing on their RTX cards in 2018, but since then we've only really seen it used in a handful of games, and to take proper advantage of those, you needed an NVIDIA GPU. That's right, no AMD. Except now we have confirmation that both AMD-powered consoles will support ray tracing at the hardware level. And they're doing it in pretty much the same way as NVIDIA. There will be some specialized hardware on the chip, which helps with what are called bounding volume hierarchy calculations. This is essentially math to work out how much space the 3D objects in a scene take up. Once you have those set, you know essentially the volume of everything, you can bounce light rays around the scene, and boom, there's your ray tracing. It's simplified. You can check out our earlier videos if you want some more detail. The exciting part here for those of us who game mostly on a PC is this also probably means we'll see an AMD GPU with ray tracing for desktops in the very near future. And when we do, we will be back with way more details about how all of this works. Onto the GPUs themselves, the Series X has a whopping 52 graphics cores running at 1.85 gigahertz for a staggering 12.16 teraflops of computing power. And remember, teraflops is essentially a shorthand for trillions of math per second. The PS5 has 36 graphics cores running at 2.23 gigahertz for 10.28 teraflops. And for some context, AMD's top-end GPU for desktop right now has 40 graphics cores and puts out 9.75 flops. So these are both looking to be faster than AMD's current top offerings on desktop. So on paper, the Xbox looks faster, though I'm not sure the gap will really be the 20% or so the numbers on paper suggest. Sony has pointed out that the higher speeds their graphics card will run at has other benefits, like quicker caches and faster times moving data around the chip. It's possible a GPU with less cores running faster will be able to respond better. Say if the chip needs to dump the data it's working on and load more in, they may have the advantage. Is the PS5's 24% or so increase in speed enough to make a big difference? We'll have to see. Sony's faster storage may be an asset here too. If it can keep those cores fed with enough data, it may be able to pump out more frames. Microsoft has also committed to releasing games on both the Series X and the current generation Xbox One X for at least the next year, which may hold them back. It's an admirable goal, but Sony gets to develop games from the ground up that can take full advantage of that super fast storage, while what Microsoft makes has to be able to at least run on the older, slower hard drives of the Xbox One. In the end, it may not matter. The Xbox One X is already faster than the PS4 Pro, but once you get into a game, the difference is pretty minimal, and it also didn't stop the PS4 from massively outselling the Xbox One. Cost was a major factor in there too. When Microsoft originally announced the Xbox One at $500, gamers almost rioted, and Sony swept in with a $400 PS4. Considering the hardware in them, I would be shocked if either of these consoles launches for less than $500, though I expect we'll see the prices pretty close to each other. And even with that, the companies will be taking a loss and hoping to make it back up on games and subscriptions and accessories. And even with all that, it's not actually clear Xbox makes any money from Microsoft. PlayStation does a little better. None of these questions will really be answered until we get our hands on the new consoles, and we still don't know when that will be. But until then, be sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned to Engadget for all the rest of your tech news. Oh.